The listening gaze. Have you ever felt it? That moment when someone looks at you, not with judgment, not with impatience, but with a gaze so gentle and warm that you suddenly feel safe, accepted, understood? We don't experience this often in life. Most of the time, when people look at us, their eyes are full of opinions, expectations, or distractions. But once in a while, we meet a gaze that feels like home. And in that very moment, without a single word being spoken, healing begins. I remember a story of a young man who was carrying a heavy burden. His life was full of mistakes and regrets, and he felt crushed under the weight of shame. One day, he went to see an old teacher. He didn't know what to say, and so he just sat there in silence. The teacher didn't lecture him, didn't ask questions, didn't try to fix anything. He simply looked at the young man with eyes full of compassion, as if saying, "I see you. I see your pain. And I am still here with you." That was enough. That silent gaze was like a hand reaching into the darkness, pulling him back toward the light. The young man later said, "I walked into that room drowning in sorrow, but I walked out breathing again." This is the power of a listening gaze. A gaze that doesn't try to control, doesn't rush to offer solutions, but simply understands. Buddhist wisdom teaches us that compassion begins with the ability to truly see suffering. Not to turn away from it. Not to deny it. But to face it with courage and tenderness. When the Buddha spoke about compassion, he didn't mean a grand gesture or an extraordinary sacrifice. He meant this simple yet profound act, to recognize the pain of another being. Because once you see suffering clearly, the heart naturally responds with kindness. Think about it. When you see a child cry after falling down, you don't need someone to tell you to comfort them. Your heart responds instantly. Why? Because you see their pain. The same is true for all of us, even as adults. Deep down, we are all longing to be seen, not for our successes or our image, but for our struggles, our wounds, our humanity. Have you ever noticed how much lighter you feel after someone really listens to you? Not just with their ears, but with their eyes, their presence? That's what compassion looks like in practice. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can offer is not advice, not solutions, but simply your undivided attention. An open gaze that tells the other person, your suffering is valid. You are not alone. Now let me ask you, when was the last time you offered such a gaze to someone? To a friend, a family member, maybe even a stranger? And perhaps even more importantly, when was the last time you allowed yourself to receive it? We live in a world that trains us to hide our pain, to wear masks of strength, to keep moving no matter what. But the truth is, no matter how strong we appear, there are moments when what we need most is simply to be seen with compassion. A gaze can do that. And it costs nothing. When the Buddha looked at someone, people often said it felt as though he could see through every layer of pretense and still accept them as they were. Imagine what it would mean if we could bring even a fraction of that quality into our daily lives, toward our children, our partners, our co-workers, even toward strangers we pass on the street. Compassion is not about changing the world in one grand act. It's about these small, intimate moments where we choose to look at another human being and see their suffering without turning away. So, maybe tonight, when you meet someone's eyes, whether it's across the dinner table, or on a phone call, or even a brief encounter with a stranger, you can ask yourself, am I really seeing them? Or am I only seeing my judgments and expectations? The practice of compassion begins with this very question. It begins with the courage to look, to understand, to allow the other person to feel, I am seen. I am accepted. I am not alone. And that is the miracle of a listening gaze. In our next video, we'll go deeper into this idea and explore why understanding suffering, truly recognizing it, is the foundation of all genuine love and compassion. Because only when we see the wound clearly can we begin to heal it. Seeing suffering as the root of compassion. There's a moment every parent knows well. A child comes running, crying, with a bruise on their knee. The instant a mother sees that small wound, her whole heart softens. In that very second, compassion flows naturally. She doesn't need to think about it, she doesn't need to be told. Her love awakens simply because she sees her child's pain. This is the secret that Buddhist wisdom has pointed to for thousands of years. Compassion doesn't arise from effort alone. It begins with seeing suffering clearly. To recognize pain, to let it touch us, to allow it to open the door of the heart. But here's the challenge. We live in a world that often teaches us to turn away from suffering. We scroll past it on our screens. We change the subject when conversations get heavy. Sometimes, We even hide our own suffering behind a smile, hoping no one will notice. But when we deny pain, whether our own or someone else's, we also block the very root of compassion. The Buddha taught that to understand suffering is the first step on the path to awakening. It is not something to fear or reject, but something to observe with wisdom. When you truly see suffering, it's like striking a match in the dark. Suddenly, the heart knows what to do. Think of the times in your own life when compassion arose effortlessly. Maybe it was when you noticed an elderly person struggling to carry their groceries, or when you saw a friend's eyes fill with quiet tears. In those moments, you didn't have to calculate whether or not to help. The recognition of suffering itself gave birth to kindness. And yet, many of us resist looking too deeply at suffering because we're afraid of being overwhelmed. If I let myself feel their pain, we think, won't it crush me? But here is where wisdom enters. Seeing suffering does not mean drowning in it. It means acknowledging it clearly, like a doctor diagnosing a wound, not to despair but to heal. The mother who sees her child's bruise doesn't collapse in sorrow. She reaches for a bandage. Her compassion doesn't weaken her. It makes her stronger, more tender, more alive. What if we could approach all suffering this way? Not turning away, not shutting down, but also not being consumed. Just seeing clearly, with a steady heart. Let me ask you, how would your relationships change if, instead of reacting with impatience, you first asked yourself, what pain is this person carrying right now? Imagine the shift in perspective that could happen, in a marriage, in parenting, even in the workplace, if we chose to look for the wound beneath the words. The truth is, every outburst of anger, every harsh word, every wall of silence usually hides an unseen bruise. Just like that child's scraped knee, the wounds of adults are often invisible, but no less real. When we see that, compassion becomes possible. I've learned this in my own life. There were times when someone's criticism felt unbearable, until I paused and realized they were speaking from their own unhealed pain. Suddenly, my anger softened into understanding. Their suffering didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me respond with more patience, more humanity. This is the heart of Buddhist wisdom, to see suffering not as a threat, but as a teacher. To let suffering guide us toward love. Because only when we see the wound can we begin to heal it, whether in ourselves or in others. So the question is not if we will encounter suffering, but how we will meet it. Will we turn away, numb ourselves, pretend it isn't there? Or will we dare to look, to truly see, and allow compassion to arise? The next time you notice someone's pain, whether it's a stranger's weary expression, a friend's silence, or even the ache within your own heart, pause. Look closely. Allow yourself to recognize it. That recognition is the seed of compassion. And here's where our journey continues. If seeing suffering is the root of compassion, then the next step is learning how to face that suffering without being swallowed by it. How do we transform the heaviness of pain into a strength of love? That is the question we'll explore in our next video. The non-judging gaze. There's a certain kind of silence that can heal. Not the silence of neglect, but the silence of acceptance. A young student once stood before his teacher, trembling with shame. He had failed, again. His effort had fallen short, his work incomplete, his spirit weighed down by disappointment. He expected harsh words, perhaps even punishment. But instead, the teacher simply looked at him. No anger, no ridicule, just eyes filled with calm trust, as if saying, "Your failure does not define you. I still believe in you." That single gaze changed everything. The student felt the heavy walls of shame begin to crumble. He could breathe again. He found the courage to try once more, not because he feared judgment, but because he felt safe in its absence. This is the power of a non-judging gaze. Buddhist wisdom tells us that judgment is often born from clinging to the self, our ego, our fixed ideas of who people should be, how things should unfold. When we release that tight grip, when we loosen the weight of the I, we open space for compassion. We stop measuring others against our own expectations, and instead, we begin to truly see them as they are. Think about it. How many times in life have you felt crushed under someone's judgment? A disappointed sigh from a parent, a boss's cold stare, a friend's harsh words. Each judgment leaves a mark, like a stone pressed onto the heart. But now remember the times when someone looked at you with unconditional acceptance. Perhaps after you confessed a mistake, or when you were at your lowest point, and instead of blame, they offered presence. Didn't that acceptance give you strength you didn't know you had? We live in a culture obsessed with performance and perfection. Everywhere we turn, there are standards, comparisons, evaluations. And while striving for growth isn't wrong, constant judgment suffocates the human spirit. Sometimes what people need most is not another evaluation, but a place where they can rest without fear of being measured. A non-judging gaze is that place. It doesn't mean we ignore mistakes. It doesn't mean we approve of harmful behavior. It means we recognize that beyond failure and flaws, there is still a human being worthy of love and trust. The teacher in the story didn't deny the student's mistake. He simply chose not to reduce the student to that mistake. And isn't that what we long for too? To be seen not as a collection of errors, but as a whole being still capable of growth? I've experienced this myself. There were times when I was drowning in self-criticism, certain that others would only see my shortcomings. Yet, when someone looked at me with eyes that said, "It's okay. You're still enough," I felt my heart soften. That gentle acceptance gave me more motivation to change than any harsh judgment ever could. Here's something to reflect on. What if you tried offering that gaze to the people in your life? The colleague who missed a deadline. The child who brought home a bad grade. The friend who forgot to call. Instead of instantly reacting with disappointment, what if your eyes could say, "You are more than this moment. I still see your worth." Imagine the healing that could ripple outward if more of us practice this. A world where compassion replaces condemnation. A world where failure is not the end of dignity, but the beginning of deeper understanding. The Buddha often taught that letting go of the ego allows the heart to open. When we drop the I that constantly compares and criticizes, we create room for connection. In that space, our gaze transforms. It no longer wounds. It shelters. It no longer condemns. It liberates. So the next time you're faced with someone's imperfection, ask yourself, am I looking at them through the lens of my own ego, or am I seeing them as a fellow human being who, just like me, is still learning? When we let go of judgment, our eyes become a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, others can find the courage to grow. Because when we release the need to define others by their mistakes, our gaze becomes a place of refuge, a place where compassion can blossom. And this is the gift of a non-judging gaze. When we let go of the I, our eyes become a home where others can rest. Compassion begins with understanding. There's a story I once heard about a man who carried anger in his heart for years. Someone had betrayed him deeply, leaving scars that shape his life. But one day, something shifted. Instead of replaying the wound over and over, he began to ask, what pain must this person have been living with to act in such a way? That simple question changed everything. He began to see the person not only as someone who caused harm, but also as someone trapped in their own suffering. And with that understanding, anger slowly gave way to forgiveness. Not because the harm was erased, it wasn't, but because compassion had found its way through the doorway of understanding. Buddhist wisdom tells us that true compassion doesn't come from obligation or moral duty. It doesn't come from pretending to be kind, or forcing ourselves to forgive. It arises naturally, like water flowing downhill, when we understand the suffering behind someone's actions. Understanding is the seed. Compassion is the flower. Think about it. How often do we judge others at first glance? The rude driver who cuts us off. The coworker who snaps at us. The family member who seems endlessly difficult. Our instinct is to label them selfish, careless, toxic. But what if we paused and asked, what unseen pain are they carrying? Maybe that driver is rushing to a hospital. Maybe that coworker is barely holding themselves together after a sleepless night with a sick child. Maybe that family member has been silently fighting battles we know nothing about. Understanding doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it changes the way we respond to it. It turns walls into bridges. I've experienced this shift myself. There was a time when someone's harsh words felt like daggers, cutting deep. But later, I learned they were going through a season of grief. Suddenly, those same words felt different. They still hurt, but I could see the wounded heart behind them. And in that moment, instead of clinging to resentment, I found space for compassion. This is the paradox of compassion. It doesn't weaken us, it strengthens us. Because when we understand suffering, our own and others, we stop reacting blindly. We begin responding with wisdom. Instead of adding more anger to the world, we become part of the healing. Let me ask you, who in your life do you find hardest to forgive or hardest to love? And what might happen if you dared to look beyond their actions, to see the suffering that drives them? It doesn't mean tolerating harm or staying in unhealthy situations. It means freeing your heart from the prison of resentment. When the Buddha spoke of compassion, he wasn't describing something sentimental. He was pointing to a strength that arises when we see reality clearly. To understand suffering is to loosen the knot of blame. To understand is to soften. And from that softness, compassion flows. Imagine if, in our families, instead of reacting to each other's mistakes with harsh judgment, we pause to understand the fear, the stress, the longing underneath. Imagine if, in our communities, we saw beyond political labels or social divisions and recognized the shared struggles of being human. Imagine if, on a global scale, nations sought to understand the fears of one another, instead of reacting with hostility. How much suffering could be transformed? The truth is, compassion without understanding is fragile. It may last a moment, but it will wither when tested. Understanding is what gives compassion roots, what allows it to endure even in the face of pain. So the invitation is simple but profound. When you encounter someone's anger, selfishness, or cruelty, try to look deeper. Ask yourself, what suffering might be at the root of this? You may not know the full story, but even the willingness to ask opens your heart. And here is where the journey continues. Understanding is the doorway, but it is not the whole house. For compassion to not only arise but also to endure, it needs one more quality, something that gives love its strength and longevity. In our next video, we'll explore what that quality is and how it can help compassion not just flicker, but truly take root in our lives. A gaze as vast as the ocean. There's a certain kind of gaze that feels like standing by the ocean. Wide, deep, endless. A gaze that doesn't shrink you down to your mistakes, but holds you with the vastness of acceptance. I remember a story of a father whose son had made a terrible mistake, one that could have easily led to anger, punishment, or rejection. The boy braced himself for harsh words. But instead, when he looked up, he met his father's eyes, calm, steady, and gentle. Not blind to the mistake, not ignoring it, but wide enough to hold both the wrong and the love at the same time. That moment didn't erase the error, but it gave the son something much more powerful, the courage to grow beyond it. This is the power of forbearance, of tolerance that runs deeper than judgment. In Buddhist wisdom, it is said that true compassion is not narrow, it is boundless, immeasurable. To be truly compassionate is to have a heart as vast as the ocean, able to hold countless waves without breaking. Think about the ocean for a moment. Storms rage above it. Winds stir its surface. Waves crash. And yet, beneath the turbulence, there is depth, stillness, and vastness. Isn't this the kind of love we all long for? A love that can hold our flaws, our failures, our fragile humanity, without collapsing under the weight? When we practice tolerance, when we choose to look at others with eyes as vast as the sea, we stop reacting to every ripple on the surface. Instead, we anchor ourselves in that deeper stillness. We begin to see beyond mistakes to the living, breathing human being who, just like us, is still learning, still stumbling, still becoming. Let me ask you, when was the last time you felt truly accepted, even in the middle of your mistakes? Maybe it was a friend who didn't walk away after you let them down. Or a partner who looked at you with tenderness even when you were at your worst. Didn't that acceptance feel like water over fire? Softening, cooling, healing? I've experienced it too. There was a time when I made a choice that hurt someone close to me. I was ready for rejection, for doors to close. But when I looked into their eyes, I saw not rage, but a quiet vastness. They acknowledged the pain I had caused, yes, but they also saw me as more than that one action. And in that gaze, I felt something shift. Instead of drowning in guilt, I found the strength to change. This is what the Buddha called the boundless mind, a mind that extends compassion without measure, like the ocean stretching beyond the horizon. To live with such a mind is not easy. It asks us to let go of the smallness of ego, the constant tallying of right and wrong, the desire to punish. But when we can loosen our grip on those habits, tolerance arises naturally. And tolerance doesn't mean we approve of mistakes or pretend harm doesn't exist. It means we refuse to let anger shrink our hearts. It means we choose to respond from vastness, not narrowness. Imagine if more parents looked at their children this way, not as perfect beings who must never stumble, but as learners who will make mistakes and need guidance, not condemnation. Imagine if more of us looked at each other this way in our communities, able to disagree, but not dehumanize. Imagine if leaders of nations looked at one another with eyes vast enough to hold conflict without hatred. how much healing could the world find? So perhaps the question is, how do we grow an ocean within us? It starts with remembering that we, too, are held by life in ways we don't always deserve. Think of the countless times you've been forgiven, or given another chance. Each of those moments was like a wave of the ocean embracing you. Can you now become that ocean for someone else? A gaze as vast as the sea has the power to heal in ways punishment never can. Because while judgment closes doors, tolerance keeps them open. And in that openness, growth becomes possible. So the next time you face someone's mistake, whether it's your child, your partner, your colleague, pause. Breathe. Look at them with the vastness of the ocean. Let your eyes say, I see your fault, but I also see your humanity, and I still choose to hold you. That is the kind of gaze that not only forgives, but transforms. And in the next part of our journey, we'll explore something even deeper. How this vast, tolerant gaze does more than accept. It can actually heal wounds at their very core. Compassion like a cool stream. There are moments in life when words simply aren't enough. Moments when language feels clumsy, too heavy, or too small to hold the depth of what we feel. And yet, in those moments, something else can flow through us, quietly, gently, like a stream that cools and nourishes without needing to explain itself. I remember hearing a story about a volunteer who chose to sit beside a patient in the final days of their life. There were no long speeches, no attempts to fix the unfixable, just presence, just a quiet gaze, soft and steady, like the surface of a calm river. The patient, though in pain and facing the end, seemed to relax under that gaze. Not because the pain disappeared, but because they no longer felt alone inside it. That is compassion in its purest form. Not always doing, not always solving, but being, a silent action without words. The Buddha once spoke of this kind of compassion. He said that sometimes the most powerful act of kindness is not in what we say, but in the energy we embody. A look, a touch, or a still presence can carry more healing than 1,000 carefully chosen sentences. Think about it. How often have you been in pain and found that explanations from others didn't help? Advice may have felt distant, logic may have felt cold. But then someone just sat beside you, didn't rush, didn't judge, didn't try to fix it, and somehow, their quiet presence felt like cool water on a burning wound. I remember an experience of my own. A close friend of mine once went through a dark time, grief so raw that words seemed useless. At first, I stumbled, trying to say the right thing, but nothing worked. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain away their suffering and simply sat with them. I listened. I breathed with them. At one point, they looked at me and said, "You don't have to say anything. Just being here, it helps." That moment changed how I understood compassion. The truth is, many of us are uncomfortable with silence. We want to fill it with words, with solutions, with noise. But compassion doesn't always need to speak. Like a stream, it moves quietly, yet its coolness transforms everything it touches. Imagine walking through a scorching summer day and finding a stream of fresh, flowing water. You cup your hands, take a sip, and feel the relief spread through your whole body. That's what compassionate presence can do for a suffering heart. It doesn't erase the sun or remove the heat, but it gives enough coolness to endure. And here's the surprising part. The energy behind this silent compassion is something we can cultivate. It begins with simply being present, anchoring ourselves in the moment instead of rushing to fix. It grows when we allow our eyes, our body, our very breathing to say, "I see you. I'm with you. You are not alone." When you think about it, how often do we long for someone to just sit with us, without judgment, without rushing, without needing to change who we are in that moment? Isn't that what true love feels like? A safe presence where we don't have to perform, explain, or defend ourselves. This is why the Buddha's teaching on silent compassion feels so timeless. It asks us to trust that our very being, when anchored in love, can become medicine. A medicine that soothes not by changing circumstances, but by transforming the experience of them. So let me ask you, who in your life right now might be thirsting for this cool stream of compassion? A friend overwhelmed with stress? A parent quietly carrying burdens they never speak of? A child who doesn't need more instructions, but simply your presence? You don't need to wait for perfect words. You don't need to have all the answers. Sometimes the greatest gift is to look at them with calm, steady eyes that say, "I'm here. I won't turn away." Compassion like a stream does not force itself. It flows naturally when we stop clinging to the need to control or impress. And in that flow, others find space to breathe, to rest, to heal. In the next part of our journey, we'll go deeper into this question. How can a single gaze, a simple act of presence, actually transmit healing energy? Where does this quiet power come from? And how can we learn to embody it more fully in our own lives? Stay with me, because the stream of compassion has more to reveal. The gaze of mindfulness. There are moments when a simple gaze can stop us in our tracks. Not because it was sharp, not because it was harsh, but because it carried a depth of stillness that seemed to reach right into us. I once heard a story about a Zen master and his student. The student was restless, his thoughts running wild, his body filled with agitation. He couldn't find his breath, couldn't settle into practice, no matter how hard he tried. And then, the master simply looked at him. Not a long stare, not a judgmental glare, just a calm, steady gaze. In that silent exchange, something shifted. The student felt his racing mind begin to pause. His breath slowed. For the first time in a long while, he felt present. What happened in that moment wasn't magic. It was mindfulness, awareness, embodied so fully that it radiated outward through the eyes of the master. That gaze carried no agenda, no impatience, no judgment, only presence. And presence has a way of awakening presence in others. This is the heart of the teaching. Compassion, to be real, must walk hand in hand with mindfulness. Without mindfulness, compassion easily turns into pity, or into a frantic need to help that ends up draining us. But when compassion is rooted in awareness, when it is anchored in the here and now, it becomes steady, healing, and alive. Think about the difference. When someone listens to you but is distracted, glancing at their phone, waiting for their turn to speak, you feel it immediately. Their attention is fractured. Their compassion may be sincere, but it doesn't land. Now imagine the opposite. Someone looking at you with full presence. Their gaze isn't pushing or pulling, it simply says, I am here with you, fully. That kind of attention is rare, and when we receive it, it feels like a gift. I can remember a time in my own life when I felt completely scattered, torn in a dozen directions, overwhelmed by responsibility. A close friend sat with me during that storm. They didn't offer advice. They didn't rush me. They just looked at me with such calm attention that I found myself slowing down. My words became clearer, my thoughts less tangled. Their mindfulness gave me permission to find my own. That's when I realized, presence can be contagious. The Buddha taught that mindfulness is not just a practice of sitting in meditation, but a way of being in every moment. When we are mindful, our eyes, our voice, even our silence carry a different quality. And others can feel it. It's like sitting near a still lake. The calmness of the water affects you, even if you don't touch it. But let's be honest, living with that kind of awareness isn't easy. Most of us are pulled constantly by distraction, emails, deadlines, worries, regrets. We are so used to being everywhere except the present moment, which is why the gaze of mindfulness can feel so striking. It's like someone has stepped outside of the storm and is inviting us to join them. And here's the deeper truth. Mindfulness doesn't just make compassion stronger, it protects it. Many people who dedicate themselves to helping others burn out, not because they lack love, but because they forget to stay rooted in presence. They absorb suffering without the balance of awareness, and it overwhelms them. Mindfulness is what keeps compassion from becoming a burden. It transforms helping into a flow, rather than a struggle. So the gaze of mindfulness isn't just about what we offer to others, it's also about what we cultivate within ourselves. When we bring awareness to our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own breath, we water the seed of calm inside. And from that calm, compassion can bloom without fear of being drained. Let me ask you this. When was the last time someone truly looked at you, without rushing, without distraction, without judgment? How did it feel? And then turn the question around. When was the last time you offered that kind of gaze to someone else? Maybe it was a child tugging at your sleeve, longing not just for your attention, but for your presence. Maybe it was a colleague who needed more than a quick nod, but the reassurance that you were truly listening. Or maybe it was yourself, in the mirror, needing not criticism, but a moment of gentle recognition. Mindfulness allows us to give that gaze, not as a performance, but as a natural extension of being awake in the moment. It teaches us that when our eyes rest on another with awareness, they become a mirror in which that person can see themselves more clearly. They may see their pain, yes, but also their dignity, their wholeness, their capacity to heal. This is why the gaze of mindfulness is so transformative. It interrupts the cycle of chaos and invites a pause. It's a reminder that beneath all the noise, there is a ground of stillness waiting to be touched. And so, the next time you find yourself with a loved one in pain, or even with a stranger burdened by life, remember this. You don't always need the perfect words. You don't always need to fix. Sometimes, all that is needed is the steady, silent gaze of mindfulness, an invitation to stop running, to breathe, to come home to the present. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore this even further, how mindfulness doesn't just calm the heart, but actually turns the gaze itself into a mirror, a radiant light where others can see their own deepest nature reflected. Stay with me. The eyes of mindfulness have more to reveal. Compassion and fearlessness. There are moments in life when fear wants to take over. Moments when everything in us wants to run, to grasp, to cling. And yet, sometimes, in those very moments, what we witness instead is peace. I once heard a story of a son sitting by his mother's bedside as she was taking her final breaths. The machines were slowing down, the room heavy with silence. Everyone around seemed tense, on edge, bracing for the inevitable. But the son, he did something unusual. He didn't panic. He didn't cling. He simply held her hand and looked at her with an unwavering gaze of peace. There was sorrow, of course, but also something deeper, compassion without fear. That moment teaches something profound. True compassion isn't fragile. It doesn't collapse when faced with loss. For compassion to be whole, it must walk hand in hand with fearlessness. The Buddha called this union karu and abhaya, compassion and fearlessness. One without the other is incomplete. Think about it. If we love but are consumed by fear, our love can turn into attachment, into desperation, even into control. We hold too tightly because we are afraid to lose. But if we bring fearlessness into love, it changes everything. We can love fully, deeply, without grasping. We can stand beside someone in their suffering, not as victims of fear, but as steady presences of peace. Maybe you've felt this in smaller ways. Imagine a child who falls down and scrapes their knee. If the parent rushes over in panic, eyes wide with fear, the child usually cries harder. But if the parent kneels calmly, offers a steady hand and a gentle gaze, the child finds courage. They borrow strength from the parent's fearlessness. The same is true in life's bigger trials. Our calm presence can become an anchor for others in the storm. I remember a time when a close friend was facing surgery. Everyone around her was nervous, whispering about risks, making the atmosphere even heavier. But she told me later that what helped her most wasn't the medical details or even the reassurances. It was the look in her partner's eyes, steady, calm, grounded. I felt like I could face anything, she said, because his eyes told me I wasn't alone. That's the power of compassion infused with fearlessness. But here's the challenge. How do we cultivate that kind of fearlessness? Because let's be honest, life is uncertain. We do lose people. We do face illness, heartbreak, and death. Fear is natural. So how can our compassion remain unshaken? The Buddha's teaching points us toward perspective. When we see clearly that impermanence is part of life, fear loses its sharpest edge. Death is not an enemy, but a truth. Loss is not a punishment, but a reminder of the preciousness of every moment. When we understand this deeply, our compassion is no longer driven by panic, but by clarity. We stop asking, how can I keep this forever? And instead ask, how can I love fully, right now? And maybe that's what the son by his mother's bedside understood. He couldn't stop her from dying. He couldn't hold her here forever. But he could meet her with a gaze of peace, telling her without words, you are not alone. My love is steady. Even in this, we are okay. That gaze carried not just compassion, but also the courage to face impermanence. It makes me wonder, when we are faced with our own storms, grief, change, uncertainty, what do our eyes communicate to others? Do they spread panic, or do they become a refuge? Fearlessness doesn't mean we never feel fear. It means we don't let fear drive the car. It means we recognize the fear, but choose to act from a deeper place, a place of love, of presence. And the more we practice this in daily life, the more natural it becomes. For example, when you're caught in an argument, can you pause long enough to soften your gaze, to listen without defensiveness? That's compassion meeting fearlessness. When you see someone struggling at work, instead of joining the spiral of stress, can you offer calm encouragement? That's compassion meeting fearlessness. When you sit with your own aging body, or the wrinkles on your face in the mirror, can you smile gently instead of recoiling in dread? That, too, is compassion meeting fearlessness. These small practices prepare us for the larger moments, when we face illness, loss, or even death. By training ourselves to look at life's uncertainties without panic, we become capable of offering others the gift of steady presence. Let me ask you this: if someone you love were facing their darkest hour, what kind of gaze would you want to offer them? A gaze clouded by fear, or a gaze shining with peace? And when your own final day comes, what kind of gaze would you want to receive? The truth is, we all have the capacity to cultivate this fearless compassion. It begins with mindfulness, coming back to the breath, to the present moment. It grows with understanding, seeing that impermanence is not an enemy, but a teacher. And it flowers in love, choosing, again and again, to let our eyes carry not fear, but presence. So the next time you find yourself in the middle of life's turbulence, remember, you don't have to let fear speak the loudest. You can pause, breathe, and let compassion anchor you. Then, when you look into the eyes of another, whether it's a child, a friend, or someone at the edge of life itself, they will see in you not panic, but peace. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how this fearless compassion doesn't just steady us, it actually transforms our gaze into a source of strength and healing for others, even in the most difficult times. Stay with me. The eyes of compassion have more to reveal. A gaze like a lamp in the night. There's a certain kind of darkness in life, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of being lost. We've all seen it, maybe even lived it. A young person drifting into addiction. A friend caught in a cycle of anger. Or maybe it's more subtle, the quiet darkness of someone who has lost hope, wandering without direction. The story is told of a monk who once encountered a man who had strayed far from himself. This man was known in the village for causing trouble, drinking too much, making enemies wherever he went. People avoided him, wrote him off, dismissed him as a lost cause. But the monk, he didn't turn away. He didn't scold. He simply looked at him, with a gaze steady and kind, like a small lamp burning in the night. And in that moment, the man felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt seen. Not judged. Not condemned. Just seen, as if a light had been turned on inside a room he thought would stay dark forever. That gaze didn't magically fix his life overnight, but it planted a seed of possibility, a whisper that said, "You are more than your mistakes." That, my friends, is what compassion with wisdom looks like. The Buddha often spoke of ignorance, not stupidity, but not seeing clearly. Ignorance is the darkness that makes us stumble, and wisdom combined with compassion is the lamp that helps us see again. Think about it. How many times have you or I been lost in our own kind of night? Maybe it was grief, depression, or a string of bad decisions. And then, someone's presence, a gentle word, or even just a look, reminded us that the night doesn't last forever. Sometimes it doesn't take a whole speech to change someone's life. Sometimes it just takes a gaze, steady enough to say, there is still a way forward. I've experienced this myself. Years ago, I was going through a season where everything felt heavy. Work felt meaningless, relationships were strained, and my own thoughts kept circling in shadows. One evening, I visited a mentor, not even planning to share much. But when I walked in, he simply looked at me, calm, warm, with eyes that didn't push, didn't pity, but simply said, "I'm here." That gaze was like a lantern. I didn't suddenly know all the answers, but I stopped feeling alone in the dark. And sometimes, that's the first step out. The teaching here is simple, but deep. Compassion without wisdom can become sentimentality. Wisdom without compassion can become cold. But when compassion and wisdom meet, they become light. Light not just to comfort, but to guide. The monk's gaze wasn't just "I care for you," it was also "I see you clearly, and I see your potential." And isn't that what we all long for? To be seen not only in our failures, but beyond them? To have someone hold a mirror to our better selves, even when we've forgotten who we are. But here's where it gets even more practical. That light, that gaze, is not just something we receive from others. It's something we can cultivate ourselves. You and I, every one of us, can choose to become a lamp in someone else's night. It doesn't always look grand. It could be as simple as not giving up on a friend who keeps stumbling. It could be pausing before judging someone harshly, and instead offering a look of understanding. It could be meeting your own reflection in the mirror, and instead of criticizing, saying with your eyes, I see your struggles. And I still believe in you. Because here's the truth. We can't all solve the world's problems. But we can each be a small light. And in a dark room, even a small light changes everything. I often think about how cities at night are lit, not by one giant sun, but by thousands of tiny lamps, candles, bulbs, stars. Each small light matters. And maybe your gaze, offered at the right moment, could be the lamp that keeps someone from losing their way completely. Now, let me ask you something personal. Who has been a lamp for you? Whose eyes, whose presence, pulled you back when you were drifting into darkness? And equally important, whose night are you being called to light right now? The Buddha's teaching reminds us, true light isn't just about spiritual moments or rare encounters. It has to shine into our everyday living. The wisdom of compassion is only real when it shows up in the way we talk to our children, how we treat the cashier at the store, how we respond to mistakes, both our own and others. Otherwise, the lamp is just a decoration. Its value lies in whether it actually lights the path. So as we move forward, I invite you to reflect. Where can your gaze become a lamp this week? Who might need to see in your eyes not judgment, not indifference, but a quiet, steady light that says, you are not lost. You can begin again. And remember, sometimes, being a lamp doesn't mean leading someone all the way home. Sometimes it just means giving them enough light to take the next step. In the next part, we'll explore how this light, when carried into our ordinary lives, doesn't just guide others, it transforms our own way of seeing the world. Because the lamp that shines outward must first be lit within. Stay with me. The night is not as dark as it seems. Compassion, a wordless gift. There's a story told about the Buddha. One day, a woman came to him, her face heavy with sorrow. She had lost a child and was drowning in grief. People had tried to comfort her with words, with advice, with reasoning. Nothing reached her. But when she finally stood before the Buddha, he didn't give her a lecture or a long explanation of life and death. He simply looked at her. His eyes, steady, compassionate, present, held her pain without turning away. And something extraordinary happened. Her heart softened. The tight knot of her suffering loosened. She began to breathe again. No words were spoken, but a shift took place inside her. Sometimes, the most powerful gift isn't what we say. It's the silent offering of our presence. Think about that for a moment. When was the last time someone truly looked at you? Not with judgment, not with distraction, but with full presence. How did it feel? In a world buzzing with noise, advice, and opinions, being silently seen can feel like water in a desert. The Buddha taught that compassion doesn't always need language. In fact, words can sometimes get in the way. True compassion is not about fixing, convincing, or even explaining. It's about being there so fully that the other person no longer feels alone in their pain. I've felt this in my own life. Years ago, I went through a difficult season of loss. People around me, with the best intentions, kept offering advice. Stay strong. Time heals everything. Focus on the positive. Their words, though kind, felt like they skimmed the surface of something much deeper. But then, one evening, a close friend sat with me. He said almost nothing. He just stayed, quietly, with eyes that didn't turn away from my sadness. And that presence, more than any clever sentence, reminded me that healing was possible. Compassion in its purest form is presence. It doesn't require us to be eloquent. It doesn't demand that we have the answers. It only asks that we be willing to be fully there, with our hearts open, our attention steady, and our ego set aside. And here's something I've come to believe. When we meet another person with that kind of silent compassion, we are not only helping them, we are also transforming ourselves. Because in that stillness, in that gaze, we are reminded of our shared humanity. Their pain reflects something in us, and our presence reflects something in them. It's a meeting point where both hearts are softened. But let's be honest, this isn't always easy. Our instinct, especially when we see someone hurting, is to do something. We rush to fix, to explain, to encourage. And yet, sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to resist that urge and simply stay. To trust that our presence is enough. So how do we practice this in our daily lives? Start small. The next time someone you love is upset, try listening more than you speak. Let your eyes convey what words cannot. I see you. I'm here. The next time you're in a room with someone suffering, notice if your body wants to fidget, if your mind wants to escape. Then gently bring yourself back. Offer them your full presence, as if nothing else in the world matters in that moment. Because to them, it doesn't. And here's a question worth sitting with. What if compassion is less about what we give, and more about how fully we are? What if the greatest gift isn't advice or action, but the silent certainty that no one is alone? I believe that's why people remembered the Buddha not only for his teachings, but for his presence. His words opened minds, yes, but his gaze, his quiet way of being, healed hearts. And maybe, in our own ordinary lives, we have the same power. You don't have to be a saint or a spiritual master. You just have to be willing to show up, with eyes that don't look away, with a presence that doesn't shrink back. Because sometimes, the most healing thing you can offer another human being is not your wisdom, not your strength, not your solutions, but your silent, unwavering compassion. So as we close this reflection, I leave you with this thought. The next time you face someone's sorrow, ask yourself, not what can I say, but how can I simply be present? That shift alone might be the greatest act of compassion you'll ever give. And in the next video, we'll dive into a secret at the very heart of this path, how to nurture compassion in every breath you take. Because presence is not just something we offer occasionally, it's a way of being that can grow stronger with practice. Stay with me. The journey of compassion is only beginning.